Hello, hello. This is Derek from One River Tea. Welcome back to another episode of Tea Soup, a podcast all about tea culture, life in modern China, and Chinese tea. I'm your host, Derek Poskin. I've been living in China since 2016, and I've been drinking, buying, and selling Chinese tea for the past decade. So, pop on that kettle, heat up your teaware, and let's get this session started. Alright, so in this episode, we return to the tradition. What's that tradition, you might ask? That's Fuding White Tea, of course. I only have a few more episodes on Fuding White Tea, maybe just one more episode that I want to talk about before we get into some of this green tea hype stuff that I want to really talk about the spring harvest, because right now it's late February, February 27, 28, and so we're just a week or two away from the very early pickings of Dragonwell green tea, of Biluochun and Suzhou, Ensher Yulu, Huangshan Maofeng, and a lot of these very early green teas from Jiangsu and Zhejiang and Fujian. They're just about to start being picked next week, the week after next. And as I mentioned in the previous episode, there's already a whole lot of tea being grown, being produced, being made up in the steppes of Sichuan. And they produce some great teas up there. I've had some really good silver needle I mentioned, and a lot of the green teas are almost indistinguishable, like the really nice Longjing teas that they make, the flattened pan-shaped Longjing teas that they make up in Sichuan. If you put that side by side with something from the Meijiawu village, I would be hard-pressed to tell the difference. And so, in my mind, what's really happening here is that Sichuan's kind of doing itself a disservice because they're not owning up to the tea that they're producing, because they're producing great teas. And so instead of Sichuan getting making a name for itself in the game of green teas and those really early spring teas, it's kind of pretending to be something else. And so it just floods the markets with these fakes. The only difference here is, like, they're good teas. And so, you know, if you enjoy the tea, that's kind of the end of the story there. What I think would be really cool, though, is to get up to Sichuan and see this kind of knockoff tea production market and see what's going on, the whole racket. And then just start selling teas as branded as Sichuan teas, like the really early green teas from Sichuan. And I can probably find Biluochun from Sichuan, Dragonwell from Sichuan, Silver Needle from Sichuan, White Peony from Sichuan, all before they're actually harvested in the rest of China, which I think would be a really funny kind of on-the-nose way to kind of show what's going on here, and then also show people that the tea is not bad. I'm kind of planning on doing that this year, and I should probably get into white tea, talk about white tea here in a second, but still on this green tea kick. What I want to do later this year, in the next month or two, is go down to Xinchang. Xinchang is a small county south of Shaoxing, which is south of Hangzhou, where they produce the Dragonwell green tea. And a lot of the Dragonwell green tea on the market from the Meijiawu village, from the West Lake, actually comes from Shaoxing, actually comes from Xinchang. And so sometimes they use the different cultivar, the Big Buddha cultivar. Other times they're using the Dragonwell 43. And so this year I plan to get down into this area of Shaoxing and kind of explore this off-kilter Dragonwell a little more and show people the production, show people the taste, and maybe we can do a comparison. But even for me, I find it difficult to source authentic Meijiawu Dragonwell. I remember last year there's so many instances where I was talking to people and trying to make sure that I was getting the genuine article. And at the end of the day, I still kind of felt like maybe I didn't get the actual thing. And this is like me talking to several different, my tea master, tea producers and stuff like that, people who I met in the Dragonwell village, in the Meijiawu village, and I still kind of have that feeling where it's like, I'm still not 100% sure about this. So this year what I'm going to do is I'm going to get down there and, essentially, like we say, follow the production from the bush to the cup. So let's get into what we want to talk about for this episode. In this episode, what I really want to do is do that final discussion on Fuding White Tea. I want to talk about the different cultivars and use, the different grades of the white tea, the different naming conventions we have. So just the overview: Silver Needle, baimudan, gongmei, shoumei, and kind of talk about their harvest dates, their taste, their look, what a good pick is, what a bad pick is, how to tell good quality versus bad quality, and just really do one final episode all about Fuding White Teas. Now, one thing that really goes hand in hand with this and with where we are in the season with the green tea looming, I really want to talk about the Chinese agricultural calendar. This is the Nongli, which begins right around the Chinese New Year and then systematically separates the year into 24 two-week terms. You might have heard of some of these terms. Some very common ones are the Qingming. We get the Qingming green tea, and there's also the Guyu, the Bailu, and I'll get into all of them later. But these 2-week terms are also called stems, and they all have descriptive names in Chinese, which kind of tells you what's happening or should be happening in the natural world during that time period. And this is just yet another shining example of the Chinese ingenuity and, I guess, folk wisdom and all this traditional knowledge the world over, where what's happening here is there's so much practical and applicable wisdom threaded into this agricultural calendar that it can inform even the non-literate peoples living in distant mountain villages, people in the cities, school children, and everyone in between as to the changes that are occurring in the natural world over any given fortnight. And this, in my mind, is just a beautiful living bridge between humans and the natural world, and one that we tend to get away from, especially decade after decade, with these incessant 8-hour work days and these artificial lightings. And it's nice to be aware of the solstices, of the equinoxes, of when the bugs are awakening in the fields, when we're just day in, day out working our 9-to-5s Monday through Fridays. So the reason I do want to bring up this agricultural calendar, the reason should be a little self-evident because, it's a natural agricultural calendar that tells you when you should be planting grain, when you should be harvesting wheat. And of course, over the past 1,000 years, as tea has become more of a staple agricultural product grown throughout the land of mountains and rivers, we see that the tea farmers have threaded their own codex of harvest times and picking grades right into the fabric of this really magnificent calendar. And so, real quick, let me give you a run through of all the 24 solar terms, and then I'll highlight a few that are really important for tea, and some of which you probably have already heard being used as picking grades for the white tea I'm going to talk about, for green teas that we've already sold. And so, yeah, let's get into it. There are 24 terms, and the first one begins right around February 4th. So the term that begins on February 4th, in my opinion, is a bit of a misnomer because the Chinese term is the Li Chun, and it means the start of spring, which, February 4th is really not when spring begins, but maybe in the far south. I think this is more a reflection of the fact that it happens right around Spring Festival. And Spring Festival is the celebration of the new year, the beginning of spring and stuff. So even though we know spring hasn't really started, it's called the start of spring on February 4th. The second solar term is rainwater, yu shui. And this is just, there's a little more rain coming down, getting the earth ready for the spring that's going to happen. The third term is the awakening of insects, the jingzhe. And this is kind of interesting because the note says the thunder begins and all the hibernating insects wake up. And this reminds me of something in the I Ching, like the Book of Changes used for divinations. There's a hexagram, a double trigram of thunder, and it's called awakening. And it talks about how thunder comes from the earth and shocks everyone into awakening all around because of the presence of the divine. And so it's just interesting to think of thunder as originating in the earth, and that's what wakes the world up for spring. The fourth solar term is the Chunfen. This is the vernal equinox. Happens right around March 21st, so right in time with the vernal equinox is celebrated throughout most of the world. The fifth solar term, you're probably aware of if you know tea, this is the Qingming. This is right around the Qingming Jie festival. It's translated as clear and bright, but I think it's almost become transliterated as just Qingming, to the point where I see a lot of tea vendors calling the Mingqian teas pre-Qingming instead of before the Clear and Bright festival. Sometimes I see a clunky translation still used. Let's see. So the sixth solar term is the Guyu. This is the grain rains, and this is when the early crops begin to show your shoots. And this is April 20th. And then we get the start of summer. This is the Li Xia. And this is May 6th. And so, again, it's still a little early for summer. I feel like everything is pushed a little early in these kind of calendars because we saw the beginning of spring in April, the beginning of spring in February 4th. And then now it's May 6th and we're already in summer. Next, we have the shoumei. This is the small grains or small full. It's a reference to the grains. So the seeds of the summer crop begin to become really plump, but they're still not yet ready to be harvested. Then we have the mangjong. This is the grain in ear. This is interesting. I think it's kind of telling you the size of the grains that it should be. Like there should be, edible fruit on the plants and stuff like that. So wheat becomes ripe. This is when the corn is looking really good. And summer planting can start again in southern China. And then we have the 夏至. This is the summer solstice. This happens June 21st. So again, this is when the longest period of daylight happens. And the nighttime is at its shortest. After this, the days will get shorter and the nights will get longer. And this is observed all throughout most of the world. 2 weeks after that, we get the minor heat. This is 小暑. And this is the beginning of the hot summer months, summer days. Then at the end of July 23rd, we get major heat, 大暑. This is really the hottest time in the year. This is called the dog days when the star Sirius is really low on the horizons. You get the most rainfall, you get huge amounts of thunderstorms and just a lot of humidity. Then here's another funny seasonal change. In August 8th, at the beginning of August, we get 立秋. This is the start of autumn. So usually this is, like the start of spring. It's about a month or two early. It's still hot, peak summertime. And then finally at the end of August, we get the 初暑. This is the limit of heat. This is like you're kind of at that point where finally it's starting to get colder. It's going to get colder. We're past the worst of it. And then September 8th, we get a very important term that we'll come back to later in this episode. We get 白露. 白露 is called white dew. And this is really the key transition from summer to autumn. In my opinion, this is really when autumn begins to come and the temperature drops a lot during these 2 weeks. And then in the 23rd of September, we get the autumnal equinox. This is the 秋分, and this is when the days and nights are of equal length. 2 weeks after that, we get 寒露. 寒露 is cold dew, and this will be very important for the white tea as well. And so we're still not at frost yet, which comes later in the end of October, October 24th, we get 霜降. This is the frost falls. The frost comes down. And so here we're definitely seeing a change in the seasons. And here every 2 weeks around these times, you get a lot of change. And so next we have November 8th, we get the 立冬. 立冬 is the start of winter. And in northern China, winter is really there. But in southern China, it's still like, I think in November 8th, they're still harvesting dansong, oolong, and chaozhou. This is when you get like the snowflake harvest and stuff like that. Then end of November, we get the 小雪. This is the minor snow. And snow begins to fall. And living in Jiangsu, sometimes we get the snow around this period. Sometimes we don't. Usually we don't get it until like February. So we're still kind of, even in the Jiangsu area, we're too far south. I know my friends in Chaozhou, one of my favorite questions to ask them, this is like southern, near the coast of Guangdong, near Fujian. I would ask them, have you ever seen snow? And most of them will tell me they've never, ever seen snow. And they really want to, though. So just tells you how even this agricultural calendar is not universal, even within the country of China. And so some places the terms kind of get dissociated with their meaning and they kind of fill in the gaps with their own things that need to happen during 小雪. And so next in December 7th, we get 大雪. So this is major snow. And this is when you really start seeing snow in the north. Again, like I mentioned in Jiangsu, we still don't see it at this point. Then we hit the winter solstice, December 22nd. This is the longest night of the year, the shortest day. And this is called the 冬至. So the cold point, the winter point. And then January 5th, we get the 小寒. 小寒. Sorry, my pronunciation's always messed up when I go from English to Chinese, so forgive me. So we get the 小寒, which is the minor cold. This is when it really winter starts settling in. And then finally, the last term of the year before the beginning of spring, we get the 大寒. This is the major cold. So this happens January 20th. And then the spring festival usually happens right around this time between like January 20th and February 20th. It happens on that new moon. And that's the Chinese New Year. The Chinese Lunar New Year begins on that new moon. Now, one thing I noticed as I was looking into these 24 solar terms is that they align very closely with the Western zodiac, that of Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces. And the only difference is that the Chinese zodiac, or the Chinese solar terms, not the Chinese zodiac, further divides these seasons in half. And so right now we're in Pisces season, and we have two solar terms, rainwater and the awakening of insects. And as Pisces season transitions into Aries season, at the end of the month, and Aries happens to be the first sign of the Western zodiac, we hit the vernal equinox. And then we transition into the vernal equinox is its own solar term in the Chinese Nongli. And so kind of as a rule of thumb, whenever we transition from one Western zodiacal sign into the next, we see a change in the solar terms, the Chinese solar terms. And then you can kind of look 2 weeks before that date, usually between like the 4th and the 8th of the month. And there you'll see another change in the solar terms, the Chinese solar terms. So every month you kind of get two changes in the solar terms, but only one change in the Western zodiac. Now, one thing that really fascinates me about these two systems is that they were both hermetically derived and yet share so many similarities. Though I guess if you're anchored by the transglobal events such as the equinoxes and the solstices, there's a little less wiggle room if you're going to try and formulate a mathematical, systematic measurement system of the year. Personally, I think the 2-week increments is much better at measuring the slow changes of the seasons than a 30-day cycle we see in the Western zodiac. But anyways, now that we have our 24 solar terms all laid out, we can start placing white tea, harvest times, harvest grades into these terms, and in so doing, try and activate our knowledge of this calendar in practice. So right now as I record this, it's the end of February, the beginning of March, and the term we're about to hit right now is March 6th, the awakening of insects. And this is a very important solar term with regards to tea, because it usually marks the very beginning when green teas in Jiangsu and Zhejiang and the white teas in Fuding start budding and can finally start being picked. So this marks the very, very first picking in this kind of region of the tea area. And this is very early March. And we have essentially 20 days, maybe 30 days until Qingming, which is that big festival of like all the best teas are picked before Qingming. And this is the period where it all starts happening. And what's really interesting is this date, March 6th, almost perfectly coincides with the official picking start date for Fuding Silver Needle, which if you listen to episode 6, we talked about all these official start and end dates for the harvest season, and it's really cool to see how they're almost very, very closely mirrored with this agricultural calendar. Because we also saw that in that article, they outlawed summer harvests and say you can't pick tea after May 15th. And if you look at May 15th, what happens around the solar term around May 15th, it's, I think, May 6th, and that is the start of summer. And so, as we said, it's kind of like still early for summer, and yet banning summer harvest, they decided to put it right around this date. And so you can see even like the fooding governmental committees that are in charge of picking seasons and picking times for the whole region's white tea, they're looking very closely at this agricultural calendar and assigning their dates accordingly. So let's get into different grades of white tea, the different types of white tea and Fuding, when they're picked, what grades they are, what they're called, and everything. And if you remember, the first one is silver needle. Now, silver needle usually consists of just the bud, though it can also consist of the bud and a small scale leaf. And really, when you break down silver needle, there are 4 main categories that silver needle falls into. And these categories are the mi jian. This is just the rice needle, the very, very bud only. Then we have the tou ya. This is like the head of the bud. Then the zhuang ya, which is like the strong bud. And then finally the da ya, which is the big bud. Now, the first time I saw these distinctions is when I visited Cho in his shop in Diantou back in 2019 in spring. And he had a lot of these boxes from that year labeled silver needle grade A, silver needle B, Silver Needle C, Silver Needle D. And I asked him about these grades, and he went on to draw all of these different shapes with the labels and everything and showed me what they are. I think I wrote a blog post about it. I'll try and link it in the show notes. But really, like I said earlier, the mijen, the rice needle, is just the bud. The toya begins to have these kind of sheaths of smaller leaves clinging to the bud. The zhuangya has a little larger of a bud. And then the daya sometimes will have like a little scale leaf that kind of comes away from the bud. And usually this is undesirable. But talking to Cho, and this is kind of what we stock, we really like this type of the silver needle because the leaf gives the tea a little bit of sweetness. It has a little more enzymes left over in it from the withering process, and so it changes with time a lot faster than the silver needle bud will. And so you'll see a more dynamic change in the silver needle with a leaf versus the silver needle without a leaf. The silver needle without a leaf, it takes a lot longer to get really the desirable results you're looking for. And so when I was talking to Cho, he said, yeah, you can make silver needle that's all mijen, but it's not necessarily picked as a mijen. It's picked with the scale leaf and then they remove the scale leaf. And I was looking at a lot of the old practices for how to make silver needle, and they talk about all the labor required picking the leaves off of the bud. And so if you're picking the leaf off the bud, we see them do this in the dansong oolongs with the mao cha production. They have the mao cha and they pick out all the huang pian and the stems and stuff like that. And so it's added labor to make a presumably more desirable result. At least it looks prettier, but does it actually taste better? And so that's one thing to consider when you're looking at silver needle in the different grades. And naturally, Cho was telling me, like, yeah, I can sell you just the buds, or I can sell you the stuff I like with the little leaf, and it's a little cheaper and tastes better. And so it sounds like the better deal. So there might be some biases here, because, I mean, that's what I sell, that's what Cho sells. And so for me, in my opinion, there's just a little more excitement with having that little scale leaf or having a little bit of leaf in your silver needle itself. Another really interesting thing I learned from Cho that day is that the germination time between when you're ready to pick the bud of a silver needle and to the point where it grows out and has too large of a scale leaf and falls into the mudan category. And usually that's about 4 to 6 days. And so as soon as it buds, you just have, less than a week to harvest all of the fresh buds before it turns into mudan, baimudan, which is the second grade of tea we'll talk about here in a second. And so these harvest seasons essentially considerably overlap by, several weeks. And so one misconception a lot of people have about picking tea at these different grades is that you go out into the field and it's all silver needle and you just pick all the silver needle, and then silver needle season ends. and then what happens is all the buds and leaves come out, and then it's mudan season. But really, these are all happening simultaneously. And so there's a lot of stuff that's going on where, depending on how many pickers you have, depending on how much land you have, you might not be able to pick all of the silver needle at the same time. And then what happens is you're kind of mixed with this, early mudan wong harvest instead of the silver needle harvest. This actually happened to our wild producers, Ju, up in Taimushan, who I talked about in episode 2. I bought all of the remaining stock of his 2022 silver needle just a month ago. And he wasn't able to pick a silver needle because it's just him, his wife, and his mom. And so what they did is they just waited and picked a mudan wong. And so this year they didn't have a silver needle, they just had a mudan wong, and that was their highest level of tea. Because what's happening is if you don't pick the bud in that 4 to 5 day window, it becomes baimudan. And so you have your whole bushes. If you pick it, then maybe you have another silver needle season in that plant, and you can pick the bud again. But you need a large labor force and able to just comb through the entire garden, pick them all within a few days of themselves, and then wait for the next few days for them to germinate again and pick again. If you can't do that, you're going to have a mixed garden of several different grades going on all at once. And so you can literally walk through the garden and say, okay, today I'm going to pick silver needle, and then only pick the buds. And then later that day, you could say, okay, now I'm going to pick baimudan. And then you pick the buds with the single leaves and everything. And so I think that's a really important thing to consider when we're talking about different grades of tea, especially that are being grown in the same garden, is that a lot of times it's happening simultaneously. This is a natural phenomenon. This is not something that's manufactured, right? And so a lot of times, and this is what I'm getting back to with the silver needle grades A, B, C, and D, a lot of times these are organizational structures that are superimposed upon the tea after it's made. Sometimes they'll pass it through a sorting machine, and it sorts the tea from like the big good picks to the weaker picks, the larger leaf picks and stuff like that. For a lot of big factories, that's what they'll do. Even for the smaller productions, I saw this in Bilo Trun. What he did is he passed it through a sieve, the freshly picked tea, and all the smaller leaves fell through the sieve. And he said, this is the grade 1. Grade 2 is everything that was up on the top. And so the different grades are being picked simultaneously. Sometimes different styles of white tea are being picked simultaneously. And then these kind of names, especially within this white tea where it's silver needle, mudan, and shoumei, sometimes they'll say, oh, well, I'll just call that a shoumei because it's a little larger of leaf. Speaking of leaves, one thing to clear up real quick, I was saying the scale leaf a lot. It's also called the fish leaf. And so if you look at a fresh bud of silver needle, sometimes you'll have this small leaf that just kind of falls away from the bud at the very bottom. That's often called the fish leaf. I refer to it sometimes as the scale leaf. And this is what kind of grows into that first leaf of mudan. And so now let's get into the mudan season. So as I mentioned in the earlier episode, in episode 6, we talked about the different harvest dates for silver needle and for baimudan. Silver needle begins March 5th and ends April 10th. That's the harvest season. And then the baimudan begins March 15th and ends April 30th. And so you get essentially 2 or 3 weeks of overlap between these two harvest seasons. And this is kind of explained by the idea of the king peony and all the different grades of white peony. So let's get into white peony, baimudan. So where silver needle had 4 different grades associated with it, baimudan has 3. There's the king peony, the exceptional peony, and then the white peony. So this is the mudan wang. Mudan wang is the first one. It consists of a single bud and a single leaf. Then comes the exceptional peony. This is usually 1 bud and 2 leaves, usually still pretty small leaves. And then just comes white peony. This is 1 bud, 2 leaves, maybe 3 leaves, but usually still they're relatively small, and you don't get more than 4 leaves because at that point, then you're getting dangerously close into shoumei territory, which we'll talk about a little later. So although the white peony harvest season technically ends April 30th, last time when I went, right around Qingming Festival, right around April 5th, and again, that's another solar term, the Qingming solar term, April 5th, April 4th, they were essentially done with their baimudan harvest. They were done with their white peony harvest. They were barely harvesting any at that point. And so a lot of their harvest, this is from Qiu and Panxi, was done in late March. And so you have those 2 weeks at the end of March, March 15th, all the way up until the Qingming Festival. That's usually the peak mudan season, and then whatever happens after that, I feel like that used to be gongmei, but they've since, exiled gongmei to the nether regions, and then we kind of get into the idea of springtime shoumei, which Zhang is the only one who's really mentioned springtime shoumei, and this is when we were on that tea tour back in 2021, right around April 6th again, a few years later. And he was showing us all the different picking grades, and he went from mudan wang, mudan jiping, mudan, and then he even went as far as shoumei. He's like, don't pick this one. This is like a shoumei pick. You want something smaller. And so having these grades in mind, we combed through the garden. I think I mentioned this story a few episodes ago. We combed through the garden. We were very particular about what kind of grade we were picking. We tried to get the best mudan wang pick we could, and it was April 6th, and we could get any of these grades we wanted to. It just depended on how conscientious we were when we were picking. And so this is why it's really important to, pay your pickers well, to give them room and board, to give them meals, to organize a lot of, in Chinese they would say like fu li, like benefits, but in the rural mountain tea picking benefits, it's more just the idea of community, like a welcome environment, good food, happy boss and stuff like that. Like I remember when I was watching them pick Dansong Oolong with Wei and his wife was fantastic. Like she'd go out to the mountains every day with the pickers and pick with them, lead them in like the songs, the picking songs and stuff like that, and just created a really positive environment filled with laughter. And I feel like that's really important because happy pickers means happy tea, means a little more conscious effort goes into picking these good grades. Because if you're just out there picking whatever you can, you're going to have a very mixed variety of tea. And now that I'm thinking about it, that is one thing that a lot of these makers that I really appreciate share and have in common is every time we go out to the fields where the pickers are picking teas, they have a great rapport with the pickers. And I'll even get into Lee, who was making our Dansong Mao Cha. He has a really low-level plot, and I remember we went out to see his winter harvest in like November, and he was like, got out into the fields and just immediately started talking, shouting across the fields to all the pickers, and was like he was picking the tea himself and just chatting up the guys and like saying like, oh, like how's the picking today, like, you know, how's the yield, how's the weather. And just like these are still farmers that are very aware of their teas, aware of the materials that are going into it, and aware of the labor that comes out of the necessary steps to have the raw material to make the tea. And so there's still this really nice connection between the maker and the picker. So we talked about Silver Needle, we talked about baimudan. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, this power vacuum in the spring harvest season that is now not really being filled by shoumei, because so many people think of shoumei as an autumn tea, that the price for shoumei is still very low compared to that of the other spring teas, you know, baimudan and Silver Needle. And so right now the shoumei, the autumn shoumei or the spring shoumei harvest dates began April 1st and they end May 15th. And so this is a huge window of time, and you don't see a lot of spring shoumei on the market. I mean, we carry some of it, but not a whole lot of it. What used to sit really comfortably in this power vacuum is the gongmei varietal, or the gongmei cultivar, the gongmei picking grade. Let's see, I'm already very confused by it. And so usually what was considered is the gongmei is a late spring, early summer harvest. And so it comes after baimudan. It still has that, you know, fresh, nice bud, really nice green leaves. And so you'll see a lot of gongmei cakes pre-2018. And this was kind of that catch-all where it's like, okay, after it becomes not really white peony anymore, it can be this gongmei, which is, gong is like the emperor, like the court official. Mei is probably the shoumei reference and stuff like that. So it's like the older brother of shoumei. That's where it fit. And now it doesn't exist there anymore. And so now gongmei, the harvest season for gongmei, is March 5th all the way down until May 15th. Because gongmei is a different cultivar. You pick it in any of these times, even if it's a pure bud, even if it's one bud, one leaf, even if it's one bud and three leaves, it's called gongmei now. I think what we'll see a little more in the future is more spring shoumei kind of being advertised, and they might reawaken the agricultural calendar to kind of emphasize this, because the other shoumei harvest dates are based on the agricultural calendar. So right now we're looking at the middle of April. This is when they really end the baimudan harvest and they start picking whatever else they can, and that's right around the guyu, the grain rains. So this would be like a guyu shoumei right around April 20th, and then you can pick that for 2 weeks, 3 weeks maybe, until like the start of summer, until May 15th, and then all spring harvest ends at that date, and then you have a break for summer. A real quick note, I looked up the actual characters for gongmei real quick, and yes, it's the same mei that's in shoumei, and then gong is like a tribute tea. And so this is like the tribute grade shoumei, which, you know, as we know, is not relevant anymore because it's the Saicha varietal, it's the local varietal. It's not imperial grade shoumei harvest. It's whenever it's harvested, it's this other varietal. It's not the Dabaihao cultivar. So as I mentioned in episode 6, the Fuding Tea regulations, I'm really excited that they cracked down on summer harvests, and they're implementing all of these things to prevent the buying and selling of raw leaf during this time. And because really the teas that are getting made in the summertime, no one really emphasizes summer teas very much. It usually just drops off all across the country and then comes back in autumn. But let's look at the agricultural calendar. Let's look at those solar terms and see when this comes back around. So looking at the harvest dates laid out in the initiative circular that we talked about 2 episodes ago, the autumn harvest for baimudan starts again August 15th until September 15th. And then the shoumei, the autumn shoumei, also begins August 15th and goes until October 30th. And so that has a lot larger of a harvest season. And one thing I've noticed is that there's not very much autumn baimudan. I've very rarely seen it. Maybe I've seen it without realizing what it is. And this kind of comes back to the idea that there's not a whole lot of spring shoumei, because these two types of teas are usually really typical of their season. The baimudan is usually in spring, and the shoumei is usually in autumn. And so if you make a spring shoumei, you're going against the current here. You're trying to sell something that people don't want to pay so much money for. If you're making an autumn baimudan, not a lot of people are going to buy the autumn version of the baimudan. They would rather get the spring version. And so usually we see these harvest times kind of devoted to a particular style of white tea. And so going back a little bit, we had that break in the summertime from May 15th all the way until August 15th. So as is typical for the Chinese calendar, that's a perfect 3-month increment of summertime. So now getting back into the agricultural calendar, we have 2 main grades of shoumei. We have the bailu shoumei and the hanlu shoumei. Bailu shoumei, if you remember from what we talked about earlier, bailu is one of the terms that happens September 8th. It's called white dew, and this is that key transition from summer into autumn. This is when the temperatures really drop, and usually the best shoumei is picked around this time. It's the bailu shoumei. It's the highest grade of shoumei usually available in the autumn. And then this kind of gets picked through the autumn equinox, and then we hit hanlu. This is the cold dew. This is when you're really getting the large green leaves. The problem with tea picked around this time is the heat. Usually you really want it to sun wither. You really want to air dry it, maybe some warm air and stuff like that. If it's raining too much, it's really difficult to make tea at this time. And so these teas, they have a big difference, the bailu and the hanlu. The bailu has, noticeable buds, kind of some smaller leaves, and the hanlu is really just the large green leaves. Though sometimes I've noticed that the autumn shoumei is usually a little more naturally browned than the spring shoumei. And I think this just comes from more difficulty in the weather. In September in Fujian and Fuding, it can still get very hot. It can get very hot. I think last year there was a huge drought, and a lot of the shoumei teas were kind of rare. They weren't able to get a lot of the baimudan harvest just because it was too hot. And then what happened is that it was kind of flipped, where the bailu, the early September pick of the shoumei, it was a little more brown because of the too high of temperatures, too much heat, too much uneven water dissipation in the leaves, where the hanlu was a little more green, a little larger. But usually one overriding characteristic is, as I mentioned earlier, the bailu, the September harvest, will have more buds, long, thin buds, kind of smaller, more tender leaves, and the hanlu will have larger, more green leaves and whatnot. Kind of looking at these two side by side, you can see that the bailu is a little more gentle, especially when you brew it. The soup is a little more clean, a little more floral, a little more grassy, where the hanlu gets deeply vegetal. And so here's a really good point to kind of bring up again, is the fact that weather determines so much in the tea making process. And especially when you're going based on the seasons and you have particularly a 2 weeks or maybe 4-week increment where you need to make tea of this grade, but the weather's too hot. Like this year, it stayed hot until October 10th, right? And so that's right until the hanlu period, and then it finally started getting cold. And a lot of harvest seasons, a lot of autumn harvest seasons in 2022 were kind of pushed later, like the Tieguanyin harvest. Usually it starts October 1st, but I think it started October 15th this year because it was just way too hot. There wasn't enough rain. And so a lot of these harvest dates, they're kind of loosely set in stone, and we looked at the circular where it says give or take a few days or maybe a week or two. But really, when it comes to the bailu and the hanlu, like the autumn shoumei, these are really difficult to tell the difference sometimes, because it also comes down to the weather, it comes down to the processing, how they were made, if the maker kind of knew how to despite the weather conditions, make a good quality tea. A lot of times, if you put these side by side and mix them together, you would not be able to tell the difference unless you really, really studied it. And so after giving you all of the three main different types of Fuding White Tea, the silver needle, the baimudan, and the shoumei, what's really interesting is I just realized now the silver needle has, 4 kind of sub-varieties within it, 4 different picking grades. The baimudan has 3 different picking grades, and then the shoumei has 2. And so to do a real quick overview of those, the 4 silver needle picking grades are the rice needle, the bud head, the strong bud, and the big bud. Where the baimudan, you have the mudan wong, the king peony, you have the exceptional peony, and then you have white peony. And then for the shoumei, you just have these 2 solar terms that are used to refer to the grades. That's the bailu, the white dew, and the hanlu, the cold dew. And so as we progress in these seasons, you kind of get lower and lower and lower, fewer and fewer varieties within it. And then what's really fascinating is the gongmei, which is the different cultivar, different heirloom varietal, has just 1. It's just always going to be gongmei. So you go from 4 to 3 to 2 to 1. And so it's a really cool system in there. One thing I really like about Fuding White Tea is how systematic it is, how contained it is, how controlled it is. And so I can really spend a lot of time talking about the details within it and kind of not worry about it being different here or there, because within all of the Fuding municipality, they're all playing by these rules. And so you'll always have kind of this terminology to work with if you're looking at buying these Fuding White Teas. You can say like, oh, give me the rice needle, or do you have any hanlu shoumei or something like that? And hopefully when you see these terms now, you'll kind of know what they're referring to. And then also a little bit of what you really need to look for, what might be better, what might be worse. As I mentioned, like the rice needle doesn't have that extra leaf that'll give it its sweetness as it ages. There's really shouldn't be a lot of autumn baimudan. In the future, we might see more spring shoumei, but at the meantime, we kind of don't see it. What we will see is a whole lot of gongmei, but the gongmei only refers to this other cultivar, this other varietal, and it could be harvested at any time. And so you might see, a silver needle gongmei. And even though they're not really allowed to call it, they might call it that. I mean, if I had gongmei, I would call it that. That's what Zhang does. Zhang still grows that gongmei, that cai cha varietal, and he'll just call it what it is. He's like, this is the gongmei white peony. This is the gongmei silver needle. It's a very, very rare kind of tea. And so going forward, I think having this foundation of knowing your different grades of Fuding White Tea, kind of when they're picked, what to look for when you're purchasing them, when you're trying to find which ones you like, I think this will be a really good foundation for you to work off of. Additionally, talking about the solar terms, this is something I'll talk about in the rest of the podcast. I'll bring up these terms like the Qingming and the Guyu, the Hanlu and the Bailu, a whole lot. And so it's really good to have the foundation and kind of see how the Chinese agricultural system kind of organizes everything, and how the farmers have kind of stitched their own codex of picking grades and harvest times right into the fabric of this calendar. For me, this is a really exciting time of the tea season. This is, the thunder's rumbling and all the insects are waking up, and so am I. I'm getting excited for spring. The buds are coming out. I'm going to start doing a whole lot of traveling in April. And in the next episodes, I'll probably start talking about the green teas and talk about the different regions that we get it from, the farms that we visit, and kind of the stories of the people behind it, and what I've learned from visiting the specific areas. And again, this is my understanding of it. These are my experiences, because I'll talk about my time in Xishandao, for instance, which is where they grow a lot of the modern biluchun, but a lot of people will tell you the best biluchun comes from Dongting. But when I was in Suzhou, everyone was like, yeah, don't go to Dongting, go to Xishandao. That's where they grow most of it. All the good stuff comes from there. So maybe it'll be different from what you've heard or what you've researched, but again, it's just my experiences. I'm really excited to get into the solar terms here, because we're coming up on Qingming, and that'll be a really huge time for green tea. I think it's really hard to explain the kind of fervor that happens in the Chinese tea communities right around Qingming. Everyone's going crazy to get the highest quality Dragonwell, the highest quality Below Truen. Everyone's like paying huge amounts of money to just secure that first harvest and that first flush. It's really just like carnival here. It's really, really exciting. So hopefully I can give you a little bit of that excitement in the weeks and the months to come. And so just keep tuning into this episodes of Tea Soup. Again, this is Derek from One River Tea. Thank you for catching this really informative episode. And until next time, guys, brew happy.